Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another exciting episode of This Is Our Life. And it could be your life, too, with just 3 easy payments of $5 trillion. Okay, I wanted to...
You can send us the money now.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you 2 stories from my mother's side of the family. My mother was from rural North Carolina. Okay, my mother did not grow up with running water. They had an outhouse. They did not have electricity until she was older. They did not have running water until she was older.
Poor thing.
My grandmother was a school teacher and a Sunday school teacher, but she didn't get paid for that. And when her car wouldn't start, she and my mother and uncle had to walk to town to go to school, which was several miles away. Now, my dad was from I guess you'd say, suburban, urban area. He basically grew up on the docks. My grandfather was a stoker or ship's engineer, and that's what my father started doing as well. And when my dad was real little, he was the mascot for the Victoria Wharf Rats football team. Football as in European football, what you call over here soccer. When he was older, he played for the Victoria Wharf Rats. Now, I used to have a couple of pictures of him when he was the mascot. He wasn't much bigger than the ball was. And the way he came to the United States was, back in those days you wore boots, you didn't wear shoes like you do now. And he had gone from Vancouver Island over to the mainland, and he went and started walking across the border. The border guard said, "Where you going, boy?" He says, "Sir, I have a football match in Seattle." No, you don't. "Oh, yes, sir. I have. We're going to play so and so. And I said, "Okay, go ahead." And then when he got out of sight of the border guards, he threw his football boots away, threw everything away, went to the Merchant Marine Hall in Seattle, signed up. And it wasn't much longer after that the U.S. government found out he was over here working, and he was not legal. So they gave him a choice of going back to Canada or registering for the draft. Well, what he did was he joined the U.S. Army. Now, officially, he entered the United States by way of Mexico, because at the time it was easier to get citizenship if you came from Mexico than from Canada. And he officially entered in, I think, Brownsville, Texas, or the INS office, or what used to be INS or whatever, near Brownsville. Anyway, you may know the song, "Delta Dawn, what's that flower you have on?" And if you listen to it, they mention Brownsville, Texas in that song. Anyway, so the story about my mother's side of the family. This was during World War II. My mother and uncle were very young at the time. My grandfather, Cuthrell, my mother's side, had served in World War I, but in World War II he was too old and they didn't want him, but he did have civil defense duties during World War II. My wife's father, on the other hand, did serve in World War II. Well, my grandparents' neighbors, they lived in the country. A neighbor is somebody who may live 5 miles away from you. It may take 2 or 3 hours to get to a neighbor's house. It's not like you live in the city and you walk 5 feet or you walk out your door and you live in an apartment building and your neighbor is 1 foot away. You knock on their door. But their neighbor had some property on oh, what's that river? Oh gosh, Pamlico River, the Pamlico River, or the Pamlico Sound area. They had some property, and this is during the war, mind you. Okay, during the war. The Japanese were interested in buying that property so they could build a like a port. Well, that wasn't a very smart thing to do. The FBI showed up, and they talked to everybody in the area, you know, finding out if these people were, you know, if they were working for the Japanese or something like that. Well, they just made a big mistake. That's all it was. They weren't collaborating with the Japanese or anything. Now, going back to my dad's side, concerning Japan in the war, my father did serve in the Canadian Merchant Navy during the war. He did the North Atlantic run. He wound up in England. My father ran away from home and joined the Merchant Navy, as they call it in Canada. And my grandmother was like, "Where's my son?" Went to my aunts. Well, at the time I only had 2 aunts. Later I had a third one. And my grandmother, "Where is Jimmy? Where's my son?" And they were like, "We don't know, Mama, we don't know." Well, they finally broke down and said, "Mama, he joined the Merchant Navy. He went off to the war." And my grandmother was not happy. And she went to her MP, or Member of Parliament, and said, "You find my son right now." Now, back in those days, you know, they would do that. Nowadays, they're like, "I'm not going to mess with you. Get out of here." You know, they wouldn't even see you. But back in those days, and he found my dad. He was over in England. And my grandfather was in the Canadian Navy. He was first engineer, or stoker. I mean, it's a nickname for an engineer because they used to have to stoke the fires.
Well, somebody has to do it.
You know, and anyway, so they detained my dad. And they were bringing him cigarettes and stuff like that, and he's like, if you don't believe I'm really 18, why are you bringing me cigarettes and da 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 da? Of course, back in those days, and you know, in my day too, you know, we smoked in hospitals. Anybody could buy cigarettes. It didn't matter how old you were. Geez, Olympic athletes would smoke. There was one Olympic athlete, and he was big on smoking cigars, and he said, "You know what? I can take this cigar, I can put it down, I can run a mile, come back, and it'll still be lit." You know, he was saying how fast he was, even though he smoked. Anyway, so my dad and his family, they had neighbors who were Japanese, or at least the parents were Japanese. The children weren't. They were Canadian. Well, the war started, and the Canadian government went to them and said, "You either have to move to the interior or you have to go to Japan." And they're like, "You know, if you trust us that much, we'll just go back to Japan." Well, my dad kept in touch with that family until he died. I wish I could find them. I mean, I don't know what their name was or anything. I have, you know, I lost those pictures in the fire, but on Facebook there's those pictures. I scanned them, thankfully, at one point. And at least 2 of the kids went into the Japanese Navy. You know, it's really odd because my best friend in Germany, Steffi, his dad had been a German soldier during the war, and my Uncle Alf, who was in the Canadian Navy during the war, his youngest brother was in the RAF during the war. Now, he was shot down over Germany. He was in Handley Page, Halifax. He was the guy that spotted to see if they were over the target. Not the bombardier, but he like told the bombardier when to drop the load. What if Steffi's dad shot down my uncle's brother? Does that mean he's my uncle? I mean, he was my uncle by marriage, but anyway. And the other story I wanted to tell you was the only other time the FBI and, people like that showed up in this little itty-bitty town in North Carolina that's still a little itty-bitty town. I've lived rural, but I've never lived that rural. When my mother married my dad, my dad had security clearances. What they were, I don't know. They don't want me to know. To this day, I don't know. He died a long time ago. But I do know that he would go to South Africa to pick up satellite data and bring it back, because back in those days there were very few satellite retrieving stations, or stations on Earth that would pick up the data coming from the satellites. You have to understand this was around the time of Sputnik and all that kind of stuff. Well, when my dad was in the Navy at the time, even though he spent most of his career in the Army, but he did spend some time in the Navy. And when they got married, the sailors all put their swords up, and my parents walked under the Arch of Swords. He was a naval officer. Anyway, now when he first went into the Army, he was an NCO. And then he went into the Navy with a commission. Then he transferred back into the Army with a commission. But anyway, because my dad had security clearance, the FBI or whoever it was, they showed up in this little itty bitty town nobody ever did anything wrong in. Well, they were moonshiners, but that's not what they were after. They were just trying to find out if, they were asking about the family. Asking about my grandparents, my mother, my uncle, and all the assorted relatives that we have there. There's relatives we have that, what was it? I don't remember. I think it was the woman. I don't remember. She was married, I think, and then she fell in love with a priest. And my mother's family is Methodist, and they've been Methodist since the beginning of the Methodism. Well, the priest left the priesthood, and she divorced her husband, and they married, and they opened a barbecue restaurant. I mean, hey, I don't know. I've never met them. Never been to that. I've never been to North Carolina. I'd like to go, though. I'd like to visit Illinois, where my wife is from. But let's see. Can I tell you? Well, I'll tell you some more stories. My step grandparents in Texas. My step grandfather, he was on the battleship Texas during World War II. He used to tell me stories about the war. I only remember one of them, though. They were taking a group picture, a crew picture, and they were all outside, on the guns, on the barrels of the guns, and one of the guns went off.
Oopsie.
Yeah. Nobody was killed. It wasn't a live round. It was like a dummy round or something.
Scared the you-know-what out of somebody.
Yeah, some people got hurt, though, because, imagine sitting on one of those, the heat that produces. I mean, imagine the heat on a rifle barrel, and then imagine that like 1,000,000 times hotter. So there were some people who were hurt, but he told me nobody was killed, so that was good.
Somebody had burnt butt, though.
No. Our chaplain on Okinawa, Mr. Stanford, he's buried at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. It's like the only funeral I've ever been to. Although I did go to a memorial service for one of my patients when I worked in hospice, but I didn't go to her funeral. But I did see her body. But and Mr. Stanford, he had Alzheimer's, and they put him in a coffin that was not an open coffin, and it was a styrofoam coffin, which really pissed me off. This was an Army officer, a retired Army officer, and they put him in a styrofoam coffin.
What the hell were they thinking? They were putting him in a giant cooler?
I don't know. Anyway,
Very odd to me.
Mr. Stanford, he had been on Okinawa during World War II as a NCO, just as a, a regular grunt, or whatever, is a grunt a Marine or an Army?
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't remember. No disrespect to anybody out there, but my grandfather was on the USS Texas. My step-grandfather was on the USS Texas. Anyway, so that's all I wanted to say.